Could you look at your life right now and say, I'm fully living? Welcome to the Parable Podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk. Today, I sit down with Jaclyn and Rachel, two sisters who co-founded Open Frame, which is a community who cherishes, empowers, and connects others after they experience a loss due to overdose.
That idea of deeply, deeply living, I wouldn't change that. There is something very holy about those places. They're just deep, deep, deep in grief, which people know.
Here's my conversation with Rachel and Jaclyn. Rachel and Jaclyn, welcome to the Parable Podcast. I am so honored to have you here today. This is our first set of twins on the Parable Podcast. Right. I know for those of you on audio, you can't see them, but their picture will be in the show notes as well. I would love to know, did your parents dress you up as always the same? Was that a part of your life?
Yes.
And no.
Yes, right. And most of the time it was always the same jumper. We're going back to the 80s. So it was jumper, big heavy tights, but they always dressed us in different shoe colors. So Jaclyn was always red and I was always blue, and they could find us from 360-degree angles anywhere and call the correct name.
Yeah.
So it's kind of smart.
Well, Jaclyn, Rachel, I do notice that, Jaclyn, you are wearing red today, and Rachel, you are wearing blue.
Wow, good. That is true.
So
it was meant to be.
That is hilarious. I always wondered, as a parent, you want to dress up your kids cute. And I think everyone, if they find out that they're having twins, are like, here, this is we finally get to do this. It's just so cute. But is there an age where, I would say this to Rachel, you're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to be doing this anymore. I do not want to be questioned, which one are you,
I think it's such a gradual process. I remember second grade, tearing through the drawers looking for something totally different, right? Yeah. Just not today. Yeah. There's always that sense of wanting to be seen. Sometimes as being twins, you're lumped as a set, which is not a bad thing, but to understand the individuality. So I think, for sure, by the time adolescence hits, I think one of us always had longer hair, the other shorter hair, anything to help people not get blocked by that psychological hiccup with the word twin. You're twin and then shut down. Yeah. Well, I don't know which one. So
it was fun though. We did have some fun with it. We did switch on teachers and we did those kinds of things, and we had a ton of fun with it. So it had its perks.
Oh, for sure.
Jaclyn, did you feel the same way? Is there a way that you wanted to branch out and be your own person? Is that something you had to figure out as you got older?
I did have to figure that out as I got older. Part of my identity, and I guess Rachel, you'd probably say this too. We were a set. Mm-hmm. So in my own mind, we were a set. Mm-hmm. It was the same, other people saw us that way, but I did too. Mm-hmm. So eventually we kind of moved apart. We did go to separate colleges in different states. And then we have not actually lived in the same state, I don't think, since high school, have we? Mm-hmm. And same time zone. We're now in the same time zone, but there's been times when we've been in different time zones too. So we did kind of veer off, but it was fun. In high school, they had dress like a twin day, at school. And do you remember that, Rachel? We didn't even bother. I just wore whatever I wanted and Rachel wore whatever she wanted. And somebody said, well, who are you dressed like? I'm like, my sister. I don't need to dress. I just am. So we kind of started to push back a little bit on that.
Oh gosh. Well, I would love to know for both of you, now that you are separate, you have your own separate lives. Was that something as you were growing up, you had to come into your own identity of understanding your relationship with Jesus? Because it's easy again for people to put you into this box. For people who's grown up as pastors' kids, they just assume oh, well, they know this. So if one of you was really into your faith or knew something, it doesn't mean that the other was feeling exactly the same way or trying to figure out their own faith as well. What do you think, Rachel?
Oh, that's absolutely true. I think it's important to remember that we had very different defining moments, experiences, those times when you look back and you think, this is when I learned X, Y, or Z. It's very different from Jaclyn. When we were 13, I actually became very, very ill with something called Guillain-Barré syndrome. Wow. And it's an ascending paralysis that kept me out of school for a good marking quarter. I was in and out of the hospital, just ill and trying to work out what that meant for me. it was a spiritual experience for me, understanding that Jesus had me the whole time, but it was a very different understanding of life at such a young age. And Jaclyn was just required to continue going to school like normal with this crazy situation happening. So that's one very distinct and defining moment that is very different for both of us. And this is how our life stories are very different, and yet they are intimately interwoven.
Yeah. Jaclyn, what about for you?
When Rachel had Guillain-Barré, that was a huge thing for me too. But my experience was obviously very different than Rachel. I was continuing to go to school and trying to be normal. But I did feel a very big sense of peace then too. And I think then as we moved on and I went to college by myself, for the first time. That was the first time when I really had to rely and got to rely, I guess I should say, on God to just pave my way and kind of make some space for me. And that was maybe the first time that I really understood that I was okay on my own and that he was kind of working things out and around me the whole time.
How would you say that you guys, do you celebrate differently? Because, you know, you have probably had a lot of birthdays together. You still have your birthdays together. So how do you now celebrate? Do you guys call each other? Do you guys hang out? Do you have something that you personally just love to do to celebrate anything in your life?
We do call.
Okay.
I think we're on the phone multiple times a day. Probably little snippets here and there. We try to get together as much as we can. It is hard. We both have young families. I have 3 children. Rachel has 2. And we live in different states. So it's harder to get together, but we try. We really try. And when we are together, if it means like all of our families are together, we try to get some time away just for the 2 of us to go do something silly.
We were just at church the other day, and one of our pastors, he has twin boys, and he said they are identical, except that our fingerprints are completely different. And so I think that's beautiful how sometimes when we hear our stories, we think, gosh, you know, it's very similar to this other person. Like, how is this different? And I think it's just a great reminder that there may be similarities, but God still uses us, and everything is so unique about us in so many different ways. And so today we're going to hear your parable story, but both of your perspectives are very different. So whoever would like to go first, why don't you kind of give us a picture of where we're going to start from and where we're going to work off of?
Well, our lives changed very dramatically on the morning of February 5th. 2017. It was Super Bowl Sunday. Jaclyn and I were both pregnant with babies. I was 6 months along. Jaclyn was 8 months along. And so we were anticipating these beautiful new babies. It was, you know, a lovely morning, anticipating the game. And that morning, our parents received a phone call from the Boston PD saying, "We're so sorry for your loss." And it was all about our baby brother, who was 33 at the time. He had overdosed the night before, sometime in the night. We don't actually know if he passed on the 4th or the 5th. We really don't know who was with him, what the scenario or scene looked like, where he was. Any of those details are very murky. We're never going to have closure. And it was a bomb for us. We could not have imagined more foreign words changing our lives. One, that we lost Justin, but to what we lost him was a shock. We're a very close family. We thought we could anticipate the next phase. He was going to be getting married. We had these babies. And then everything came to a screeching halt, and we met despair and darkness, I think, like we would never have imagined.
Yeah, so that's where it all began. Jaclyn, I loved what you said, Rachel, about, you know, just the details, like never having closure. Jaclyn, what was that like for you? Again, you're in this place of joy. You're excited about the birth of your child, and then you get this call from your parents.
So I was living in Alaska at the time, and Rachel and my parents were in Florida, and my brother had been in Boston. So the Boston PD called my parents in Florida. So they were 4 hours time difference ahead of us. So I got the call. Well, actually, I think it was actually Mike, Rachel's husband, who called my husband at about 5 a.m. They waited as long as they could before they woke us up. And then my husband told me, and it was incredible. I was so pregnant. I remember like the first thing I thought was, I need to breathe. I just really need to breathe. This baby needs to breathe. And kind of an interesting sort of, you know, very new life, death, like all at the same time, right? Then I had to get permission to fly to Florida from my OB because I was so far along to be able to even attend everything. So I'm thankful I was able to go. I left that night. Flights in Alaska leave in the middle of the night. So I had all day at home to kind of try to understand what happened. And the detail that we do know is that he had taken some cocaine and it was laced with fentanyl. So it wasn't actually cocaine mostly. It was mostly fentanyl that killed him. So we started, like, those first few moments were just complete, like, what even just happened? A friend of mine came to sit with me, like, thank God, one of those blessings, just the blessing of physical presence from someone. And she told me later, a couple of years later, she said, it took you hours to tell me what actually happened. I told her that he had passed away, but I couldn't even, like, it was just an impossibility. Like, what does this actually mean? How did this happen? We didn't know he used drugs. Was he addicted? Did anyone know? Like, all of the things that we just didn't know. And we still don't completely know now. And then I had to kind of get myself together a little bit. I do remember distinctly, we talk about all of this tragedy has led to the creation of this organization, which is becoming a nonprofit called Open Frame, where we want to step alongside people who've lost from addiction or from an overdose. What we would say in like the addiction world, you're either not addicted, you're addicted, or you're recovering, or you're dead, right? Yeah. Is kind of how it goes. And then in that space of when you're no longer alive, it's like post-recovery. So we like to say we're a post-recovery organization where we're trying to help people find life after something like this. Part of the problem when it comes to losing someone from overdose is just those simple things of, when someone says, how did they pass, which that comes up. It's a hard decision. Like, do I tell somebody that it was an overdose, or do I say something else, or, what do I say? Because you never know how it's going to hit the other person. Like, it brings up a lot of fear, I think, could that happen to me? Could that happen to my people? It also can bring up a lot of, prejudice, I guess, about
a lot of shame.
What the kind of, and shame, the kind of person that happens to. When that happens, who it happened, what kind of family that happens to. Like, there are all these assumptions that are all of a sudden made, and they don't fit, like, those assumptions, none of them fit, my brother or our family at all. Someone at once said to me, oh, you must not have known him very well then, and moved on. And I thought, oh, right. You would think that, but that's not true. I didn't go into it, but there are just a lot of things that come out that are just not true. So you kind of have to weigh it. Part of my story too is we were about to be moving from Alaska to Michigan. So I was about to start packing up my house to sell it. And then we moved. So I lost my immediate support system just a couple of months. Like, I had a baby 4 weeks after, and then we moved cross country. So there were a lot of changes coming. And when we did have those changes coming, you're meeting people and they say, oh, do you have any brothers or sisters? The question for me would, along the lines of, do I say how he passed, would also just be, do I even tell anyone I had a brother? Do I even say that? Because then it brings up the question of what happened, and do I want to get into that discussion? And part of what Open Frame, with this being a national crisis now, we had 100,000 people die of overdose in 2021 in the nation. That's a football stadium full of people, so when we talk about God and redemption and light being shown on things, and the fact that we are just humans, which means we all sin, what is our role and how do we do it? And how do we have to hold that shame, that guilt? How do we hold those people with love and care? How do we move forward and heal?
Jaclyn, thanks for that statistic too, because again, I think when we tell our stories, even when it's very difficult and challenging, my mind opens up to things that I've never experienced, never even understood or even realized is happening. So for you to even say that statistic, it's shocking. And it just helps me better understand and learn more about my brothers and sisters in this world that are just going through so much. And maybe it's silent because you're right. Like, there is such shame and stigma attached to that. So there are so many people that don't even have that outlet. Rachel, I'd be curious for you as you walk through this. Again, you guys are separate. You're leading your own lives. What was it like for you to walk through this healing process? Because it's been since 2017. You are still healing. I don't think that ever finishes. What was that like for you, learning of that information, wrestling with how do you share this? How do you deal with it yourself personally?
That's a great question, and one that's intensely personal, as you know. And I was, or had, I guess, had the privilege of living with my mom and dad the day after the funeral. After we said goodbye to Justin, physically, they moved into my home, into the nursery that was to be for the new baby. And they were with us for about 3 months. Funny story is that Justin even moved back in. My parents decided to cremate him because nobody has a plan for this kind of thing. So the decision was made. And then eventually he joined us in the house in a jar. And this is where the dark humor comes in. But it's really funny because I had not lived with him since, we were teenagers before college or, grad school, that kind of thing. And so here he was in the house. And when my parents ended up moving out into their home they were waiting to be built, they left him here for a while. And it felt great that he was here, as strange as that was. So when he left again, it was another mourning process for me to have to let him go. And I say that because it's those little things that are unexpected and so emotionally demanding at the time. And so I think that's kind of how the whole process goes. It's a day at a time, obviously. I was focused on keeping my unborn baby growing, my 1-year-old functioning, and my parents making sure they got up, ate, went for a walk, that kind of thing. So for me, my own grieving process was somewhat put on hold. Probably it was a big blessing because I could just focus on what we had to do today. But because of the grief, the guilt and the shame and the responses that were coming back unintentionally, I think, from a lot of people, and having lived in a town, I did not move. I found that I 100% shut down for about a year. I really didn't see anybody aside from our immediate family. I didn't have the bandwidth or the capacity to sort through any more reactions to things. And so what I did is I actually started writing my story. I wrote the whole thing down. A lot of that is going to be and is on the blog that's on our website. That's my side. And then Jaclyn has added her own as well. But for me, that was really how I started making sense of where God was in this, my own healing, understanding the greater picture of God's sovereignty and where he does show up, where that little flicker of light is right in the deepest, darkest, saddest moment when moving forward seems impossible.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, it does seem impossible, especially when we're in this feeling and it feels overwhelming. We've never maybe experienced something like this before. One of your things about Open Frame is that you are dedicated to fully living. So how did you get from that place to be like, I need help. I want to be able to fully live in my life, because there's a time and there's season for everything. So how did you choose that for yourself, Rachel?
Part of it is just the natural rhythm of the river of life, the Spirit of God, just moving forward. Luckily, he doesn't leave us where we are. So daily or weekly, there would just be a reminder that there's something beautiful around the corner. Thankfully, we had beautiful babies, a lot of life. During that first year, Jaclyn, on her way from Alaska to Michigan, spent 12 weeks here with us in Florida. And so she was here the day that I brought my littlest one home from the hospital, and we were able to just be together as a family. Yeah. Those things are so beautiful. Those moments, the memories, the laughter, there is joy. There is, the juxtaposition of the loss with the new life and these children, and the hope of, just making a new memory even. Is really evident, I think, in those moments. But I think choosing to not get stuck in a moment is really what it's all about. Is the grief can feel overwhelming for a few days at a time. It can just take you down. We call it a grief bubble. People call it different things. You're just moving along, and then, you're in the grocery store, you hear a song on the radio, and then all of a sudden it's just over. Yeah. Just overwhelming. And it's just in those moments, you can't almost get stuck. You have to move through it. And I can honestly say there have been moments of deep healing and happiness, joy, and not even happiness, just a joy that I've only experienced in the last few months since Open Frame that I had not experienced since the loss of my brother. So this healing is a constant sort of quest. And there's also that recognition that nothing's going to be the same. Nothing feels the same. Nothing looks the same. So there's a resignation of living here and now with this darkness. And yet there is always an advancement, I think, without even really expecting it sometimes. And that's just the grace of God.
For you, Jaclyn, to be able to fully live, what was that experience like for you? And do you have any, and everyone's different, but do you have any kind of suggestions or encouragement to anyone to kind of step into that choosing to fully live in their life?
There's a ministry in my town that deals with prison reentry and addiction recovery. So the way I started to unravel this whole thing was starting to get involved there. I'm on the board. I'm still on the board. My neighbor is one of the people who helped found it. So I find that to be interesting too. Like, we moved to this new town where we didn't know anyone and ended up right next door to somebody who kind of got me connected with this. So I started to try to understand what we came up against, right, with this behavior problem that my brother had. He was just doing things we didn't know about. So I think I was trying to understand, what was that? What does that look like for other people? So I kind of got fully involved there. Through that involvement, we realized like the experience of losing somebody from addiction and recovering from addiction are two different worlds. In the same way that like somebody who's in prison has a very different mindset than somebody who's been released from prison, right? Like there are two very different ways of interacting in those spaces. So it helped me and help us kind of understand, like, this is different. Living with a grief and this issue is different than living with it. But working that out over a couple of years actually was very helpful and healing and helped me to understand kind of where I fit and started to understand maybe a little bit of those things I didn't know about my brother, which was helpful for me. Where some people don't want to look at that side at all, it was helpful for me. But I started doing that, kind of working it out that way. I wish there was like a one-stop shop for advice with these sorts of things about fully living. But Jesus says things will not always be easy. You know, we've been told that as humans, we don't want pain. We don't want things that don't go well, right? We just don't, and we don't like it. We want to run away from it. We don't even want to exercise because it makes our bodies hurt. And that's part of being a human too. And we also are told that we are sinners. And Paul will say, I am the chief of sinners. Those two things have come together for me. One, I am a chief of sinner, just like my brother was, just like anyone else is. My sin might not kill me today, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have ramifications in my life and that I need redemption from it. So there's a great equalizer there. We're humans, and that's just what it is. And because of that, there's going to be pain and problems in our world. We've been told that. And in some way, I think feeling these deep losses, the gift of it in a way is that it's a real living. It's a living in all the spectrums. It's a real understanding of what does this life really mean. I don't go to bed at night thinking, I wonder if I understand this, or did I get a deep day? You know, and that's a gift on its own, to be honest. You know, the deep comes in the depths of the sorrow and in the highs of the joy, you know, the joyful times. But they have to come together, really. There was a moment that first day when I found out that Justin passed. I was standing in my kitchen and I looked outside and I was really overwhelmed with this gratitude for life. You're realizing like my brother had just lost his hours ago and is not doing this anymore. And the fact that I can see sunshine hitting the snow and the birds, and now that I'd be understanding I was going to have to go through this entirely new process. So I guess it would be that, just an understanding that life is not meant to be highs only, and the lows can give us just as much depth and understanding as the highs, even though it stinks.
Yeah, it does. Jaclyn, thank you for sharing that perspective, because I'm a huge crier. Like, I cry over all the things. And for a long time, I was embarrassed about that, or I was just like, I would always apologize. And I like what you said, that, you know, God wants us to experience all of life. And that's how I experience it. And it helps me, you know, feel other people's feelings, like be right with them in their emotions. And so I think God wants us to feel all the things. And when we read through the Bible, we kind of look at Jesus' emotions. He wasn't, you know, just like even keel, like he felt all the things so deeply. So that's a really beautiful statement. I like to quickly just go through, you know, when you were talking about assumptions for Open Frame, you guys now get to have this space where you can freely be able to discuss in a safe setting, because sometimes either not even just in the church community, in all community, there is these stigmas and shames. So tell us a little bit about how Open Frame started and why it is so important to have this safe space where you can talk about this.
Part of the isolating factor of this kind of traumatic loss is not being able to find yourself in the conversation. And that's also, it's personally, it's spiritually, it's in, churches do and don't welcome these conversations. We've had our own experiences. We can do better as a human race here. So that isolating factor is really the driving force behind Open Frame. It was, what do we really need to heal? What do we really want? We need to be able to speak the words aloud. After trauma, just actually saying the words overdose, whatever your trauma is really starts to unlock a healing process. And so we've created, even with Open Frame, a signal, an open box with an open O. And the intention of that is to be able to, on the days that you feel strong enough or that you want to share your story, you even just can display that. Or we're going to have merchandise, we're going to have hats and sweatshirts event soon, where you can put your sweatshirt on and you can say, I'm doing this in honor of my person, in honor of me, in honor of the story. Because any kind of expression, outward expression, whether it be visual or verbal, is really, really, really important, not only for destigmatizing some of the trauma and the unsavory pieces, but also in just moving forward. And so we want to give everybody that chance also to create a visual community that Jaclyn and I both say we can't wait to be somewhere, the grocery store someday, and see somebody we don't know with an Open Frame hat or a sweatshirt, and understand that we have that immediate connection, and to see that, working and fleshing itself out.
One of the other things we're doing now is we do have support groups that have been meeting, which is interesting. Actually, I live in a very small town, and I didn't know that there was anyone else in my town that had experienced this. This is kind of the nature of the beast, right? We don't talk about it. And when we think about the statistic, 100,000 people, I think I'd said 2021, it was 2020. We don't have the 21 statistics yet, just to be clear. But when we think about all the people left behind, like even if every one of those people left too, but we know it's way more, it has to be everybody. And through launching Open Frame, we've found 5 people in my town that have dealt with this that I didn't know beforehand. So we've been meeting. We meet for coffee. Sometimes we talk about it, sometimes we don't, but we regularly meet. And Rachel has some in her town that meet. And then we have a few online that meet. One is incredibly amazing. It's women only, and it is faith-based. And there are 10 of us, and it's 5 states are represented, and we meet together and talk about what is going on. Some people just lost, are like within the last 6 months, and some are 8 years out. So we kind of have the gamut. And it's incredible. Like that first meeting when we met together, at the very end, somebody who said, when are we getting together for a retreat? There is an incredible and an immediate bond with people that is healing. Like that is what we were missing. Like I just wanted to be able to look at somebody and have them actually just understand without having to say, and also being able to say the word overdose or autopsy report or like all the things that are so unsavory and sound like they come from a movie that are shocking, just to be able to say these words and there's no shock. You can actually, in fact, a woman said, I see the same expression on every one of our faces. And that alone, it's so healing. It is incredibly, incredibly healing to sit with people who understand. And it's been fun because it's been all these different people from all across the nation now. And we welcome anyone who would want to get involved in a group to contact us. We might have to wait until we have the right number. Like it's a little bit of a game, finding somebody and all the things, but we've started and it's been incredible.
Rachel, how did you guys decide, okay, yes, let's create this space? And has there been something out of that you're like, wow, I guess I never realized I needed this?
Yes. So probably within the first year of losing Justin, Jaclyn and I were sitting in a Whole Foods chatting over some crazy takeout because our baby's for the hour safe. So we had 1 hour to enjoy. And it was very, very, very clear at that moment that Open Frame needed to happen. So years ago, did we know what that meant? Absolutely not. But it was 2 summers ago that I actually packed my boys up and we spent the summer with Jaclyn and her family in her house. That's the frame that I was looking at. And we said, what about open frame? It was that exact picture.
Wow.
And it was just after hours and hours of brainstorming and coming down with the mission and what are we doing here? And taking into account all of our experience. What is it that we need? Because, the deal is it's easy to find, recovery support. And every kind of loss with addiction or in the addiction world is very different. My husband, we lost his dad very young. He was an alcoholic for 20, 30 years. That loss is very markedly different than the loss of the trauma, every piece of it. And yet it's very easy to sort of believe that they all live in the same house. And so when we started parsing it out, Jaclyn with her experience and looking at our life experience, it just started to come together. It was really seeking after the heart of God. How can we be a comfort? How can we be the heart of God here where shame and guilt fall away and healing is actually possible with a sense of community and joy that we can actually find the hope, the openings to move forward.
I love what you said, like find the joy and find the openings to move forward, because that just seems so challenging. But I think that God does provide those opportunities if we're open to it and if we're looking. Jaclyn, my question for you is, one time a pastor posed this question, is that, if you had an eraser and you could erase parts of your life, would you? And my dad had a really horrible childhood experience, and I've asked him that multiple times where I said, would you go back and erase that? And he said no, because that has allowed him to become the man that he is. For each of you, is there parts that you would erase, or now looking back at it, you have seen how God's hand has created into the women, the moms, the co-founders that he has allowed you to be?
That is a very deep and good question. Thanks, Danielle.
Sure.
Oh, that's good. I would erase things for my brother if I could.
Yeah.
That's what I would do. If I could, I would take that eraser and I would know more. He actively hid everything from us. In fact, the Thanksgiving before he passed, our whole family was in his apartment, and I remember having a sense like something doesn't quite feel right, and a very deep pressing, like not now. Don't do that now. Enjoy this now. But I wish I could go back. That would be all on him, honestly. Like he would have had to do things differently, and I have no power over any of that, but I wish I could. I wish I could erase things and change things there so that the outcome would have been different. I wouldn't change what has happened because of it. That whole, you had asked earlier that, what would you say to someone? And that idea of deeply, deeply living, I wouldn't change that. There is something very holy about those places. They're just deep, deep, deep in grief, which people know. And the trauma that happens, like we've mentioned this, but traumatic loss, when something happens just suddenly and you don't know it's coming, that's what we mean by that.
Yeah.
Is its own beast. And then all the stigmas and the things that happen here. I'm thankful that God was so faithful because we didn't have community. Like it's just started in the last 3 months, which has changed everything. Rachel had mentioned like since Open Frame, there's been this rush of joy. It's because all of a sudden we have that thing that we haven't had forever. And if now we get to give that and help more people have that, that is just the best. I feel like I have a purpose that I didn't have before. And my understanding of where God is and how he holds us is very, very different. And there's something about sitting in those places when it's just so clear what's wrong and broken that, which is human. Like we are broken. And that perspective too, like that real equalizing, like it is just what it is. And God puts his Holy Spirit and heals us anyway. I just wouldn't change that.
Thank you, Jaclyn. Rachel, what about for you?
I think what Jaclyn said is true about wanting to change things for Justin or change things for our family. Trying to figure out the genesis of things. I guess that's the game we play. You look backwards and you wonder, where did the pieces rub up against each other? How did this work out? How did we get here? So I guess, that would be lovely to go back and rewrite some of those little endings. But in terms of where we are today, understanding the sovereignty of God and the goodness that is the sovereignty of God, despite the human pain, despite the isolation. There is a deep, deep, deep knowing and a deep peace that transcends the darkest moments. And so I treasure, this is about open frame as well. I treasure being able to sit next to somebody in their nightmare because it's no longer scary. And that in itself is just a lovely, lovely gift.
It's good, Rachel. You know, sometimes for somebody who's walking alongside someone else, it's very, at least for me, it's super awkward. I don't want to inconvenience them. I don't want to trigger anything. So I don't say a lot, or I don't know what to say. Like, what would be the best thing to say? And so a mutual person that we know, Amy Sylvester, she was on a previous episode. She had said, just say their name, just ask them. And so with that today, and this is only because of Jesus, today when this episode launches, it is Justin's birthday. So I'd love for you to tell me something that you loved about your childhood with Justin, like a special memory, or just what his personality was like, to celebrate and honor his birthday today.
First of all, it is beautiful to say his name, and thank you for that question, Danielle. That is such a gift. It is such a gift just to be asked to talk about them. And when people tell stories about him and call to say those are gifts too. He was such a goofy human. He was funny and he made everybody laugh. And it was hilarious growing up with him. Like we had
It really was.
We got in tons of, we just had, I don't know,
He would just push every silly scenario to the next level. So you think we're just right in it. All of us together. This is ridiculous. Whatever it is. But, running up to a friend's house knee deep in mud because we know they're home alone and knocking on the windows and then tripping and falling and going home and, stopping at the 7-Eleven on the way to get a Slurpee that then busts all over. So now we're covered in mud and Slurpee. It's just the silliness and then just the willingness to embrace, and just go for the joy of life, of living.
He was also very good at keeping relationships going. Like in his adult life, he had certain friends that he talked to who he hadn't seen in ages, but he talked to once a week. Like he was just very good at kind of keeping those. And he was remarkably good at it at the end, like with my kids. I think it kind of helped with the time zone change, actually, because it would be very late at night for him when he had like a moment, and then he would call and I get to talk to my boys who were at the time, what were they, 4 and 2 or just about 3 and 1. So he would be able to call and like had relationships with all of them. One of my last memories was my son's birthday was February 1st and he died on the 4th or 5th. And he said, do not sing happy birthday unless I am on FaceTime. And so I have a video of us singing happy birthday with him on FaceTime singing happy birthday. And that's the last time I saw his face. But he was that kind of person.
It's funny, when we were really little, just a fun story. We were at Disney World for Halloween and we were all dressed in our costumes. And I happened to have a Snow White costume on and he was a pirate with his sword, the whole thing. And while we were walking around getting candy, the witch from Snow White came out with an apple that was truly the size of our heads. It was massive. And she had those big bony hands and she was polishing the apple in this big black cloak in the nose. And she saw Snow White's my costume and she started making her way toward our family, very clearly gunning for me. I started to panic and I remember backing up and not knowing where to go. And there were crowds of people and Justin, he just stood in front of her and drew his sword. And I think that's just how he was. He would have done that for anybody that he loved. And so I think that just encapsulates his heart and the way that he saw the people around him. He never looked away.
I told my 10-year-old, I told him 2 days ago what happened to my brother. They all know that he passed away because his heart stopped, which is true. That's exactly what happened. But they don't know why. And then we never, it's a sensitive thing. And when do you tell your children? 2 days ago, I told my 10-year-old. And that conversation was perfect in so many ways. Like if I could have bottled that and then that it encapsulates kind of what we're trying to do at Open Frame. It was a conversation about how much like these great memories my son has of him. He was like, he was so nice and he loved us. and was so great. And we really miss him.
Yeah.
And also, what kind of choices? How do you end up in that situation? How do you live? Why do we live the way we do? How do we heal from things like that? And how do we choose to remember him? And it was a beautiful, beautiful conversation. But those little ones even, I mean, Owen was only 4, so he has the best memory of them. But they remember him. And my daughter, who was in utero when he passed, never met him, but she'll talk about him all the time. And she has with joy and happiness, about because she hears these stories about him that are fun and funny, and we tell her how much he loved her. And he had bought her a pair of baby Uggs. So one day he passed away, and then one day I got a package in the mail, and it was this gift that he had picked out for her. They know that he loved them. And it's this complicated conversation about these beautiful people that we miss, that were children and adults and functioning, with jobs and relationships, not these stereotypes and these stigmas that we place. And these, our family was whole and we talk. It wasn't that we were fragmented and he was on the outs. These things happen, and it's okay because things happen, period. Things happen and we make choices, and it's just the way that it is. And that's the beauty, right? We're sitting in this beauty, this joy and the sadness at the same time.
Yeah.
And we would like to sit with more people in that space at Open Frame.
And it's really for our children that we started this, in part because knowing that we need to have this conversation with them. They need to know, and we want them to be able to talk about it in a world that is healthy, to have the conversation where they don't feel that they're unable to look at part of their own family history, eyes wide open, and knowing the redemption and the love that was there.
There was no shame or guilt from my son when he heard. And I think that is true. There should be none. Yeah. There is no condemnation in the blood of Christ. And also, we all have the same shame and guilt about anything. That's the conversation I had. I'm like, when we lie, when we do whatever we do, that doesn't have those same kind of effects. We all have that. And so God covers all of us. And in that way, we can release it.
Well, Rachel, Jaclyn, thank you so much for just kind of holding that tension between the beauty and the pain, and what community brings to us when we can have a safe space to talk about this. And hope that one day as we, continue to have children and relationships and conversations, that it does become a place where we can have no condemnation and just share so that we can help others. Who knows, by what you guys are doing with Open Frame, just so many things that could come out of this. And so I'm so grateful to hear what you guys are doing and what is truly in store for the both of you and your community. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Danielle.
Yeah. All of your information and how to contact and get in touch with Rachel and Jaclyn for Open Frame will be in the show notes. So again, thank you guys so much for being on the Parable Podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I love the emotion and the hope that were coming from Rachel and Jaclyn. I am grateful we get to honor their story today, as well as Justin's life. To connect with Rachel and Jaclyn at Open Frame, go ahead and visit daniellezapchenk.com. Here are 2 takeaway questions from our conversation. Number 1, we may never have the details or the closure that we need this side of heaven, but how can you move beyond that certain unknown detail and take a step into the direction of seeing the way God is working in your life? Number 2, I recognize that not everyone shows their emotions like I do, but I loved how Jaclyn said that all of our feelings can come out of this deeply holy place. The next time you feel something so strongly, acknowledge it and listen to it and thank God that He has given you this emotion. Thank you so much for listening to the Parable Podcast. Subscribe wherever you listen, whether on Apple, Spotify, or on YouTube, and leave a rating or review. That really helps people find out about these parable stories and that we can connect those stories to ours. I appreciate my technical producer of a husband, Eric, for editing this podcast today. Grateful that you took the time to spend a moment with me. Remember, your parable showcases a God who wants you to fully live in your healing. See you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.